and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Bright Brains Podcast. Today, we're talking to Ethan Hackett about the issue of underdeveloped jaws. All right. So, welcome to the show, Ethan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hey, no problem. So, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to be interested in this issue.
So I guess starting all the way back to my childhood, I grew up, I was pretty much good at everything came easily for me. I was good at everything. The teacher said I was very gifted, I have a bright future. But as I was getting older, really starting in high school, I started noticing a lot more issues with my mood, depression. I started noticing more brain fog during the day. A lot of times I kind of hit a wall where I just couldn't focus or just couldn't motivate myself anymore. And it was also around this time I started getting more interested and serious about music. And so as high school went on, I would come home, I'd feel very tired from school and end up just napping all afternoon. So by the time I'd wake up, I'd be still be groggy, wouldn't be motivated enough to work on my homework. And then it was hard to fall asleep because I had just spent all afternoon resting. I even My grades were going steadily downhill over high school, and my senior year, I even had to do a summer school class to make up for a physics course that I didn't pass. But eventually, I finished high school, and this was when I hit this point where I was like, okay, if this is my problem, if I'm just depressed, then I need to start trying these lifestyle changes and trying to get to the bottom of this. So I started doing things like picked up cycle commuting and riding my bike places. I started only drinking water, making some changes in my diet. I stopped eating meat at the time and even tried vegan for a bit, as well as trying supplements. I picked up like meditation, all these different lifestyle changes, but over the years, I just continued feeling worse. And so 2020 was really when I hit this wall where I was like, physiologically, something's just not adding up. It's not normal to feel this awful all the time. And that took me on this journey where I started going from doctor to doctor, running all these tests and trying to figure out what could be causing this issue, researching online until I finally read online about people with a type of breathing problem called UARS or Upper Airway Resistance Syndrome. So at first, I didn't think my problem could be related to my sleep, and I also didn't think it could be related to sleep apnea because I thought this was something that affected people that were older, people that snored, people that were overweight or had a large neck. But I read that a lot of these people they would do sleep studies that showed that there were no apneas or periods of stop breathing or oxygen desaturations, but they found out they still have this breathing problem. And so throughout my research, what I basically learned was that um, this is just a subtype of OSA, which means that you're still struggling to breathe in your sleep, which is preventing you from progressing into REM and deep sleep and causing fatigue. Um, when it was originally discovered, it was believed that it was something that affected younger and thinner people because originally OSA was studied more on older and heavier people, but it's just recognized as being kind of a part of the same disorder. And so that basically led me down this rabbit hole of research, and I met my last orthodontist who I felt like I finally clicked with, and this guy seemed to understand at least somewhat what I was talking about. And his recommendation basically was doing an adult orthodontic palate expansion procedure to make my upper jaw wider, and that would kind of make my nose, the floor of the nose wider, as well as he said that they worked with a surgeon to do this operation called the Bimax advancement, where by cutting and advancing the upper and the lower jaws, it expands everything in the airway here. That kind of that's kind of my background.
All right, then. So, did you get that surgery?
I did get the surgery, but see, that whole year of 2020, initially, or this was 2020 going into 2021, I was kind of dependent on my parents, in and out of jobs, couldn't function. And so my parents didn't want to do the surgery at first. They said that sounds invasive. And so I basically reached out to my orthodontist and I said, look, like I know I'm going to need to get the surgery. I just want to move on with my life. And so I want to start consulting with surgeons, despite what my parents weren't supportive at that time. And he said, I fully support that. My plan was initially to consult at least 4 or 5 surgeons so I could find the best option. But um, as my symptoms were worsening, this brain fog was worsening. I was becoming more dissociated. My sense of reality was becoming more foggy, fuzzy. My memory, my sense of time, everything was becoming distorted. And so it reached the point where I was like, okay, I'm either going to do the surgery here with the surgeon my orthodontist referred me to, or if I feel like if I lost that insurance case, I'm going to try going to somewhere like Cancun and try doing like medical tourism. So I ended up winning the insurance case and doing the surgery here. And immediately I started feeling some degree of relief, but it was felt like my airway was just kind of slowly and swelling over the months. But what I noticed was over time, I felt like this brain fog started improving, and it was almost like I could access more parts of my mind, and it was easier for me to do things. So I basically started riding my bike again. I went back to part-time work, working at a library, which was what I did in high school. I went back to part-time school. I started going to clubs again to try promoting my music project. But once I went past the 6 month mark, I realized that I was still tired. My symptoms were still not progressing to the extent that I was hoping for. And I felt like something was not quite right. So I started researching again and consulting with surgeons regarding the second thing.
So then what happened? So you got the surgery, your symptoms, you felt like they weren't progressing the way you wanted, and you started doing more research. Did you have to get another surgery or?
Yeah, so I basically consulted 2 surgeons that were both in California. I don't know why, but the best sleep apnea surgeons I found are in California. The best sleep apnea doctors in general are in California. And this was Dr. Casey Lee in the Bay Area from Sleep Apnea Surgery Center, and Dr. Michael Gunson, who has his clinic, Arnick Gunson Facial Reconstruction. And so they both kind of confirmed my suspicion. They said it wasn't really a great operation. I would have done this differently. And after consulting both of them, I felt like Dr. Gunson was able to explain better what the issue was. And he basically said, I'm not trying to sell this surgery to you or tell you that you need to get this thing, but I would have done the surgery differently. And he basically explained how. He showed me a diagram of the different kinds of movements that he would have made, as well as kind of confirmed what I felt like the issue was. The concern was basically that as my jaws were kind of receded and constricted my airway, the surgeon was going to advance the jaws forward, but he didn't have the skill to rotate the upper jaw enough to sufficiently advance the lower jaw. And so he basically kind of compensated by giving me a huge shin, which you might kind of be able to see on the screen now. I realized that there
I
was this
kind
kind
of.
of metal like plate that was in my face that was starting to cause irritation. Um, And so his advice was basically, I want to shorten your chin, do more of a rotation on the upper jaw, and this will basically allow me to advance the lower jaw more. But he did say too, he's like, it's not usual for sleep apnea patients to be as debilitated as you are. So he's like, I can't guarantee how much this is going to improve your life, but he was able to say, like, yeah, there is a diagnosable problem here.
That's awesome. So did you end up getting that surgery and did it improve your life?
I'm in the process of that.
You're in the process of it. Awesome. All right, then. So let me ask you this. How does underdeveloped jaw happen?
Yeah. So one thing I learned in my research is that in earlier human history, most of our jaws were larger and wider. Generally, their teeth were straighter and they didn't have the same kinds of breathing problems. And that it seemed more of like a recent thing. Whereas for the longest time, it was in mainstream orthodontics said that crooked teeth or small jaws is mostly genetic. But it's really more of an issue of modernity that older people didn't really seem to have this issue. And so I learned that there were certain factors in the Industrial Revolution that could have contributed to our jaws not developing as large as they used to be. For example, we started chewing more soft processed foods. A lot of people were switched from breastfeeding to where they were fed with bottles. And so this is very interesting. I learned that the way that we hold our mouth and our face influences the way that our face develops later on, as even as an infant. So if our mouths are closed and if our tongues are when we swallow and just generally at resting, our tongues are supposed to be up on the roof of their mouth, as opposed to kind of breathing with our mouth open and our tongues on the floor of our mouth. And that over time, this can actually encourage the face to grow wider and more forward just because of the exertion of the muscle of the tongue and the face and the lips and whatnot. And so that was another thing I learned was we weren't breastfeeding as much. We were eating softer foods. We were, as well as even just things like living indoors more, and which could trap allergens and predispose people to mouth breathing. So see, these were some of all of the contributing factors that I learned.
So, have you heard of this thing? I keep hearing about it online, especially with Generation Z. It's called mewing, where
Yes.
like it's like these exercises. So, my question is, are there like exercises that somebody could do to help develop their jaw?
Yeah, mewing is kind of I think there's a lot of truth to that, but also a lot of pseudoscience because I believe that two orthodontists from Britain, John Mew and Mike Mew, founded the mewing movement. John Mew was one of the first orthodontists in Britain to come to these conclusions, or at least he believed, like, I don't believe that crooked teeth is genetic. I think that there's something environmental at play. And he believes that it has that correcting or having proper oral and facial posture can encourage us to have larger jaws. And so he started treating patients, and has pretty good results. And that was practice was eventually moved on to his son Mike Mew. Now the thing was that mewing kind of caught on the internet where people felt like even as adults, maybe if I practice the proper facial posture, this is going to make my jaws larger, which obviously that's a lot more complicated. And I think even John Mew himself, he said 8 is too late, meaning you want to try and encourage people to get proper posture as early as possible. I remember even actually as a child, I grew up with asthma, which again could predispose me to mouth breathing, as well as I had a lisp, which again impacted my ability to get this tongue posture. And so if I had that corrected earlier on, from say a speech therapist or somebody like a myofunctional therapist who treats specifically how the facial muscles interact with each other, that problem or that tongue posture issue could have been corrected, and I might not have had so much sleep apnea later on.
Gotcha. How widespread is this issue?
I believe that it's very widespread. I think probably the majority of people in industrial society to a certain degree have underdeveloped jaws, at least most people that have had some degree of orthodontics. Even for me, I've been on 3 and now I'm going on 4 rounds of orthodontics. So for some people, it's just this ongoing issue. But I think that there's a very small percent of the population where this becomes such an issue where they're struggling to function. They can't stay awake during the day, they can, pass their classes. They can engage socially and things like that, which was kind of my problem. I do think, say, like a lot of people that have issues, whether it's they struggle to breathe through their nose and they feel like they have to breathe through their mouth, people that snore or people that just have crooked teeth are more likely to have this issue.
What are orthodontics?
Orthodontics, well, so my understanding is that the orthodontic practice started, I want to say a little over 100 years ago, maybe about 100 years ago, which was involved using like wires and pieces of metal to try straightening the teeth. But then later, like I said, I think this was around the 60s when John Hughes started his, or maybe the 50s or the 60s when John Hughes started his research. And he calls his field of study orthotropics. Orthodontics means correct or straight teeth, and orthotropics means correct or proper growth, because he believes that orthodontists are treating the symptom and not the problem, which is that our entire jaw structure is not as big as it used to be.
So orthodontics are braces.
Orthodontics are people that um, straighten teeth mostly, yeah.
Gotcha. I mean, but like braces, is that like a form of orthodontics?
Yeah, braces is the most well known, but I mean, even say like Invisalign headgear, which I know that's not really popular anymore. But airway is starting to become more of an issue. Remember when I went to my last orthodontist, I asked him, I said, why was this problem not identified earlier? I wish my early orthodontist could have at least looked in my mouth and said, hey, you're at risk of developing this issue. And his response was, we just didn't know. And a lot of this is still new in the field.
So you said that this weak or underdeveloped jaw can cause problems such as sleep apnea and teeth crowding. What is sleep apnea and what is teeth crowding? And are there any other health issues as well that this weak jaw can cause?
Yeah. I mean, this is also why the work of Dr. Gunson interests me because he diagnoses the patient's jaw structure as a whole and not necessarily looking at keeping the teeth straight. He gave me I was watching one of his interviews online where he said he had a patient that, because of their recession in their jaw and their underdeveloped jaw, they were unconsciously jutting their jaw forward, which was putting strain on their TMJs. And so he said, well, this is why their TMJs look bad and they have pain. It's because they're compensating for having underdeveloped jaws. Regarding what sleep apnea is, like I said, I think that this condition originally was discovered in like the 60s and originally studied more on heavier people where they would sleep for a period of time. A lot of times, snoring is very common with sleep apnea, where if there's resistance in the airway and there's some vibrations, and that's what causes the sound of snoring. And these people would have such obstruction that they would stop breathing completely, sometimes for upwards of 10 seconds or more, which would create a noticeable decrease in the oxygen in their body. So in the long term, that could cause issues to their heart or their tissues if they're not being properly oxygenated. But then we learn later on, it's not just about we're not getting enough oxygen, but if we're not breathing properly in our sleep and if we're struggling to get proper airflow, then this is also disrupting things like REM and deep sleep. So on my last sleep study, for example, every time I hit REM sleep or every time I went into deep sleep, I would only stay there for very briefly and then went right back into light sleep because once I would get into these deeper stages of sleep, as the muscles in my airway would relax more, this would create more resistance and create these arousals in my sleep.
All right. So when you did that sleep study, were you using a CPAP machine, which is used to treat sleep apnea? Were you using one of those?
Not for that sleep study. They do sometimes do like titration studies, but that's usually after because they'll
Mhm.
oftentimes do a sleep study that shows, okay, you have sleep apnea, and then sometimes they'll do the titration where they'll give you the machine, and then once you fall asleep, they'll try making adjustments so that you're having less of these apneic events. But the sleep study that I did, they had EEG, so they had some wires on my head, they had some wires on my face. They had something, I think, in my nose. And so they're basically looking for, when we go into REM sleep, the muscles in our body relax so they can see if my skin is relaxing. They can measure that against, my brain waves. They can see if there's negative pressure in my airway or if I'm breathing through my mouth. And they can look at all of that and use that to make a diagnosis.
Gotcha. So since you've been using the CPAP machine, has that helped your symptoms?
So back in 2021, before my first MMA, I was basically wrestling with a CPAP machine, and then I also tried another machine called the BiPAP. I guess for people listening, PAP just stands for positive airway pressure, and the airway collapses because of negative pressure causes the airway to collapse. So by using either continuous or bi-level positive airway pressure, that can help stent the airway open so that there's less resistance and obstruction. And what was interesting to me was that I remembered there were days here and there where I would wake up and it was almost like some of these layers of brain fog would lift. Like I said, I'd wake up and I'd sit down and work on music for 4 hours, whereas before I couldn't work on music for 4 months. Or I'd wake up and I'd sit and I'd clean my room, whereas maybe for months I slacked and it was super messy. Or I might wake up and I felt a bit more clear-headed and I could sit down and practice piano, whereas maybe I didn't practice any piano for like the past year. So I was noticing these kinds of small and inconsistent improvements, but I felt like over time, in the long term, my sleep quality was just continuing to worsen and I just couldn't tolerate it. It was very hard to sleep with. I sometimes would even get panic attacks when I was falling asleep. So in the long term, it just wasn't really something that I could tolerate. I had to find more of a long-term solution.
All right. So, when you were telling your story, you talked about the symptoms that you had. Just for people listening right now, what are some signs and symptoms that individuals who think that they might have an underdeveloped jaw, what are some signs and symptoms that they should look out for?
Well, I mean, I would say first of all, like physiologically, crowded teeth. If you're breathing through your mouth and if you struggle to breathe through your nose, those are probably the most obvious ones. But I would also say my personal biggest complaint was always brain fog. But obviously, that's a very vague term and it kind of means something different depending on who you ask. But brain fog is definitely one of the most common complaints as well as chronic fatigue. But I mean, the it's simple. Like if you're sleeping 7 or 8 hours and you're still struggling to get through the day and you still can't focus and you're still feeling tired, then something's just not right with that. And I think that that needs to be explored.
What would be the potential long-term consequences if someone had an underdeveloped jaw and it was left untreated?
Yeah. I remember actually one time when I did a presentation, I was offered to do a speech at like a small music festival. And I talked about how when a person is chronically sleep deprived, it can lead to a kind of sleep debt, which can cause problems similar to being intoxicated, where maybe they can't think as clearly. They're going to make more poor choices. They might make more accidents. They're more prone to getting into car crashes. They're more prone to feeling depressed or anxious, as well as just physiologically. If your blood oxygen is going up and down all night, in the long term, I mean, like after decades and decades, you could be more likely to develop strokes, heart attacks, and other issues like that.
What are some early intervention strategies? Like, let's say there's a parent out there who has a kid who's dealing with some of the symptoms that you've noticed. What should that parent do?
I mean, I would say first of all, just do some research because, let's say like even for me, I grew up with a lisp. I was mouth breathing. But there could be other symptoms too. I know like maybe I think I was very intelligent and I was just able to compensate for it. But I've heard that children with sleep apnea might have symptoms similar to ADHD, where they're having trouble focusing, they're causing disruptions in class. But other than that, like if your child is snoring or mouth breathing, or is having issues with their speech, have like a speech impediment, now there's more research being done, so a lot more orthodontists are becoming aware about these issues. And so you can hopefully research and find an orthodontist that's airway aware and can hopefully be able to identify, oh, your child is not keeping their lips closed, and that's causing these issues or whatever the problem may be, so that ideally we can figure this out earlier on before it becomes too much of a problem.
What steps do you think we should take as a society in order to, one, increase awareness and also two, to promote early prevention to help people no longer have underdeveloped jaws? Should we just tell women to stop buying formula and start breastfeeding again, or like what should be done?
Um, I mean, I guess this is also where I talk about mewing a bit because this is kind of controversial where um I don't think Mike Mew and John Mew necessarily expected the whole concept of mewing to get so big. I don't think they even coined the term mewing. I think it was people online that came up with that. But a lot of people online, when they first discovered mewing, they were more interested in trying this, as older people for aesthetic purposes or trying to get like a stronger jawline, which at first that kind of frustrated me. I'm like, this is my illness and this is my trauma. I don't want people to think this is plastic surgery. But now I also feel like, if you it's kind of like being taller. Like I don't doubt that being taller, you might be able to get more perks in life. And so like if you're more interested in the aesthetic portion, like I just can't really comment about that. But I do think that a lot of this kind of like orthotropics movement is bringing more awareness about how um and the work of John might be about how improper posture of the mouth and the tongue and breathing through your mouth and snoring and whatnot can cause these issues.
So you said proper posture of the mouth. What is the proper posture of the mouth?
Yeah, I want to say too, mewing too is it's kind of just internet slang for what really is called myofunctional therapy, which is a more, I guess, professional or proper approach where you could actually go and pay somebody to almost like it's almost like seeing a physical therapist, and they'll help you with exercises in your mouth to retrain the muscles so that you're always maintaining a lip seal, means you're not dropping your mouth open. Um, Ideally, the tongue at rest should be rested on the palate. And so, let's say, for example, when you swallow, then the suction of the swallow can, over time, can basically encourage the muscles of the tongue to stay in that position. It's like muscle memory, as well as breathing through the mouth. Some people say chewing hard foods is part of posture. I would also say if this is all happening properly and your airway is developing, this also promotes a better neck posture because when our airways are small, we compensate by compressing our neck and jutting our heads forward.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, but are you looking to reach a dynamic and engaged audience of curious minds? Well, look no further. Bright Brains Podcast is the perfect platform to showcase your business or product. You'll be able to reach a diverse and intelligent audience and engage with listeners passionate about personal development, technology, and more. Elevate your brand through thought-provoking discussions. Don't miss this opportunity to promote your business on one of the fastest growing podcasts in the market. Contact us today to discuss advertising options and elevate your brand to the next level. Contact us at brightbrainspod@gmail.com to secure your advertising spot on Bright Brains today. Again, that's Bright Brains with a Z pod, P-O-D, @gmail.com. Now, back to the podcast.
Tell me a little bit about your music that you make. What genres do you dabble in?
Yeah. Um, so admittedly, this is part of why I like to talk about this jaw issue is because it's cathartic for me because sometimes when I look back at all these years, I'm like, I was failing classes, failing jobs. I felt like basically a deadbeat. But the one thing I feel like I have to show for myself for all these years is I kind of journaled a lot of these experiences with this music project. And so when I was in earlier in high school, I had these different projects, and I started experimenting with dark ambient music. And so my that was kind of the genre I stuck with. I think just because at the time I was just suffering from this chronic depression, and so that darker music was, or more industrial music was more of a reflection of my mentality at that time. So I would describe it as kind of dark, atmospheric, moody, industrial. And over the years, I basically put out albums where, on some of my album covers, you might see like I have one of me wearing when I first tried a CPAP, for example, or I have an album cover of when I tried getting a palate expander, or other like some of the album artwork is kind of when I'm experiencing derealization from the brain fog, and the whole world is just kind of like feels like it's fuzzy and fogged up and like not something that I can consciously engage with. So pretty much my music I view as a way of documenting what I was going through, but also with the hopes that that the music as well could bring awareness to this issue.
That's awesome. What is your artist name?
Yeah, it's Origin of Styx is the main music project. That's Origin OFSTYX. If you Google that, you can find me on pretty much any streaming platform.
So, what kind of instruments do you use to make your music?
I actually, well, I don't know if the guests can see. I'm in my studio right now. So I have several computers, synthesizer, keyboard. I have a lot of microphones as well as knickknack instruments. So I'm most fluent in the piano, but I've also dabbled in things like I have a guitar here, violin, even a pan flute and like a harmonica. And so sometimes I'll just take recordings or I'll just make everything in the box where I'm producing beats and can basically mix everything together and manipulate the sound and create that into something emotional and completely different.
That's awesome. Can you play some now, or is that
I
possible? Just
I mean, like, did you want me to play from like my speaker or something?
yeah, yeah. Just so maybe like just so that people can hear.
I would love to. I'm
Eh,
just not sure if it's going to go through on
uh,
the Zoom because sometimes it has like a thing where it blocks out the anything
yeah,
that's not
you
a voice.
yeah, you're probably right. Where can people go to hear your music? Do you have like a SoundCloud or?
Yeah. SoundCloud.com/origin of sticks. But there's also like a link tree. And so that basically has all my links on there. If you go on Spotify, look up Origin of Sticks. If you go on YouTube, you'll find my songs as well as some of the videos that I have out there. And really anything else, like whether if you prefer like Apple Music or Pandora or whatever, you should find it on there.
All right. And how do you go about spreading awareness other than going on podcasts? I know you mentioned earlier about giving a speech at a music festival. How else do you go about spreading awareness of the issue of underdeveloped jaws?
I mean, I guess two things to say about that. And firstly, is when I do fully resolve these issues, I'm actually planning on writing a book where I want to make it a semi-autobiography that kind of goes in depth about these issues. But I would say, secondly, it's also very likely that once I solve these issues, then I just kind of will want to move on with that part of my life and really just focus on music and my career.
Yeah, yeah. All right, then. Well, hey, this has been a great conversation. I've really learned a lot. Where can people go? I know you mentioned your SoundCloud. Is there anything else you want to promote? And also, where can people go to learn more about underdeveloped jaws?
Yeah, so I have an email, originofsticks@gmail.com, and I had this idea, although I haven't gotten takers yet, of setting up a Patreon where for $20 a month, um, then I'll do like a Zoom call and basically help you for like an hour with one of your songs that you're working on. That was just kind of an idea. So I want to try making money from music through different revenue streams. But as far as learning more about underdeveloped jaws, I know there have been some books published recently. There's one called Breathe by James Nestor. I think there was one just called Jaws, or like it was Jaws or the history of a hidden epidemic or something. As well as just even on some of my other interviews, like back last year, I did an interview on a YouTube channel called Jaw Hacks, where the host of that YouTube channel has his own podcast where he pretty much specifically interviews people with these problems as he himself grew up with a similar issue. So you can search for that podcast and look at his channel as well.
All right, then. Yeah, this has been great talk. Before I let you go, was there anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to touch on in regards to this issue?
Um, I think that's pretty much all I have to say. I just wanted to say thanks a lot for having me on. I also enjoyed this interview a lot as well.
Hey, no problem. I enjoyed it. I learned something new, and I'm sure my audience did too. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us for another enlightening conversation here on Bright Brains. I hope you've gained valuable insights and inspiration to fuel your own bright ideas. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like and subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform or however else you listen to this podcast. Also, we can be found on all major social media. Just type in Bright Brains with a Z. And remember, the brightest minds are those that never stop seeking knowledge.